Part 1, Dramatic Hook, 250 words. At 0600 hours on July 10, 1941, the field south of Mtsensk, 220 kilometers from Moscow, lay quiet under a gray dawn. German panzer crews of the 4th Panzer Division, veterans of blitzkrieg victories, prepared for another routine advance. Their confidence was absolute. In the previous 3 weeks, General Erich Hoepner's Panzergruppe 4 had destroyed over 1,200 Soviet tanks and captured nearly 30,000 prisoners in the Smolensk sector. The Soviet T-20s XS and BT-7s, with thin armor and outdated guns, had posed little threat to German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks. German tankers, convinced of their technical superiority, openly mocked reports of a new Russian tank. They dismissed the T-34 as a crude, unreliable machine, unworthy of concern. But at exactly 0607 hours, a formation of 34 Soviet T-34/76 tanks from the 21st Tank Brigade, led by Major Mikhail Katakov, emerged from the tree line at 400 meters. Within minutes, the German front line was in chaos. Panzer III tanks fired 37mm armor-piercing rounds, which ricocheted harmlessly off the T-34's 45mm sloped armor. The German 75mm short-barreled guns of the Panzer IV also failed to penetrate at standard combat ranges. In just 7 minutes, the T-34s tore through the German anti-tank screens, destroying 17 vehicles and inflicting over 120 casualties. The laughter in the Panzer crew's radios turned to frantic calls for support. The mockery ended as German officers witnessed a force they had underestimated break through their lines with relentless speed and devastating firepower. Part 2, Historical Setup, 350 words. The events at Mtsensk on July 10, 1941, took place during the opening phase of Operation Barbarossa, Adolf Hitler's campaign to conquer the Soviet Union. At precisely 0530 hours, Oberst Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Division was positioned 4 kilometers northwest of Mtsensk, a strategic railway junction on the Zusha River. The division's advance elements, supported by elements of the 35th Infantry Division, were tasked with seizing control of the Oral Highway and cutting off Soviet retreat routes toward Tula. Opposing them was the newly formed 21st Tank Brigade, commanded by Major Mikhail Katakov, a veteran of the battles of Kokon-Gol. The Soviet brigade, consisting of 34 T-34/76 medium tanks and 10 KV-1 heavy tanks, was ordered to mount a counterattack to delay the advancing Germans and protect the vital supply lines to Moscow. The German Panzer III, mounting a 37mm KWK-36L/45 main gun and protected by 30mm frontal armor, formed the backbone of the division's armored force. The supporting Panzer IV OSV D, with its short-barreled 75mm KWK-37L/24 gun and 30mm armor, was designed primarily for infantry support, not tank versus tank combat. Both models were equipped with Maybach HL-120 TRM engines, providing a maximum road speed of 40 km per hour. German doctrine emphasized rapid maneuver and close coordination with infantry and artillery. Soviet planners, under General Dmitry Pavlov of the Western Front, had begun to deploy the T-34 in significant numbers for the first time. The T-34/76 was revolutionary by virtue of its 45mm sloped frontal armor, 76.2mm F-34 main gun, and wide Christie suspension tracks, which provided superior mobility in mud and snow. At 26 tons, the T-34 was heavier than both the Panzer III and Panzer IV, and its 500 horsepower V2 diesel engine allowed it to reach up to 53 km per hour on roads. At 0545 hours, German reconnaissance units reported the presence of Soviet armor in the forests east of Mtsensk, but divisional headquarters dismissed the threat as negligible. The German High Command, including General Heinz Guderian, remained convinced that Soviet armor could not match the performance of their seasoned panzer divisions. Part 3, Rising Tension, 300 words. At 0557 hours, radio intercepts from the 4th Panzer Division's forward observers first noted engine noise and movement in the tree line southeast of Mtsensk. By 0602 hours, German infantry of the 35th Infantry Division, positioned along the Oral Highway, reported visual contact with Soviet tanks advancing in a staggered wedge formation. At 0605 hours, Oberleutnant Hans Becker, commanding a platoon of Panzer III tanks, ordered his crews to load armor-piercing rounds and prepare to engage what he still believed were obsolete Soviet models. At 0607 hours, the first T-34/76 tanks of Major Katakov's 21st Tank Brigade broke cover at 400 meters. German tank gunners opened fire. The 37mm rounds bounced off the T-34's sharply angled frontal armor. Within seconds, the Soviet tanks returned fire with their 76.2mm F-34 guns, knocking out 2 Panzer IIIs and an anti-tank gun emplacement. At 0609 hours, German artillery from the 105th Artillery Regiment attempted to lay down a barrage, but the Soviet tanks maneuvered rapidly, using their wide tracks to cross ditches and soft ground with ease. On the ground, German infantrymen described the advance as unstoppable. At 0611 hours, radio transmissions from the Panzer Command Post were filled with urgent requests for air support and heavier anti-tank guns. By 0614 hours, 17 German vehicles had been destroyed, and over 120 men were dead or wounded. The 4th Panzer Division's perimeter was breached in less than 7 minutes. From the vantage point of the Soviet command, Major Katakov's calculated use of terrain and concentrated force had achieved total surprise. German field commanders, confronted by a tank they had dismissed as a myth, were now forced to reassess their entire anti-tank strategy in the face of a weapon they had never expected to meet in battle. In the hours following the catastrophic breach at Mtsensk, the full magnitude of the Soviet counterattack began to sink in across the German command structure. By midday, recon elements of the 4th Panzer Division, battered and disoriented, limped back to their forward supply depots with grim tales of indestructible Soviet tanks and shattered infantry lines. The division's acting commander, General Major Willibald von Langermann und Erlenkamp, convened an emergency briefing in a commandeered farmhouse on the Oral Highway. Maps were unfurled, telephones crackled with frantic reports, and staff officers struggled to piece together the scale of the disaster. Simultaneously, news of the Soviet breakthrough reached Army Group Center headquarters. General Feldmarschall Fedor von Bock demanded immediate clarification: were the reports of new, heavily armored Russian tanks exaggerated? Within hours, Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights were dispatched over the Mtsensk sector, photographing the burned-out hulks of German armor and the telltale tracks of T-34s crossing previously impassable terrain. Intelligence officers, poring over intercepted Soviet radio traffic, confirmed that the 21st Tank Brigade had not only survived the initial engagement but had also launched a coordinated withdrawal, preserving much of its fighting strength. On the Soviet side, Major Katakov's success was celebrated but tempered by caution. Soviet engineers and recovery crews worked through the night, salvaging damaged T-34s and KV-1s for rapid repair. Red Army correspondents, including the renowned war reporter Vasily Grossman, arrived at the battlefield to document the first Soviet victory against a major German armored force. Within days, dispatches from the front reached the Kremlin, prompting Joseph Stalin to personally commend Katakov's brigade and demand a full report on the performance of the new tanks. In Berlin, the repercussions were immediate. The Oberkommando des Heers, OKH, summoned technical advisors from the Panzerwaffe, demanding explanations for the debacle. German journalists, previously restricted from reporting frontline failures, were ordered to withhold all mention of the new Soviet tanks. Behind the lines, rumors spread among enlisted men: a new Phantom tank had appeared, immune to standard anti-tank weapons and capable of crossing swamps and forests with ease. The mythos of the T-34 was born not only from its battlefield performance but from the growing sense of unease that now gripped the Wehrmacht's eastern front. The initial shockwaves of the encounter at Mtsensk would soon ripple far beyond the battlefield. New orders began to circulate among panzer and infantry divisions, while intelligence analysts scrambled to assess what this new Soviet weapon would mean for the future course of the war. The unprecedented resilience of the T-34 forced both German and Soviet analysts into a period of intense technical and strategic reassessment. German ordnance officers, recovering fragments of 37mm and 50mm shells from the T-34's cast-off hulls, were astonished by the lack of penetration. Reports detailed how standard-issue anti-tank guns, once considered adequate for any Red Army vehicle, had proven almost useless against the sharply angled armor of the T-34. The tank's sloped glacis, combined with high-velocity 76.2mm armament, had rendered most German armored doctrine obsolete in a matter of hours. The contrast with previous encounters was stark. Throughout the summer of 1941, German panzers had faced mostly light and medium Soviet tanks, BT-7s and T-20s XS, that were vulnerable to both tank and anti-tank fire. The engagement at Mtsensk marked a dramatic departure. The T-34's wide tracks allowed it to traverse muddy fields and deep ditches that immobilized German tanks, granting Soviet crews a tactical mobility that caught even seasoned officers off guard. Field reports from captured German soldiers, compiled by Soviet interrogators, revealed widespread confusion. Many believed the Russians had imported British or American tanks, unable to fathom that such a design was domestically produced. Allied military attaches, operating out of neutral embassies in Stockholm and Ankara, began relaying coded summaries of the engagement to London and Washington. By cross-referencing Luftwaffe aerial reconnaissance with Soviet press releases, British intelligence analysts confirmed that a new generation of Soviet armor had entered the field, one that could threaten the entire German advance toward Moscow. In a confidential memo circulated among British Army staff, Major General Gifford Le Quesne Martel, a prominent tank theorist, wrote, "The T-34, if produced in sufficient numbers, may well change the entire nature of the Eastern Front." Within the German High Command, technical debates raged over how to counter this unexpected threat. Designers at the Henschel and Krupp factories, already working on prototypes for heavier tanks, were ordered to accelerate development programs. The engagement at Mtsensk became a case study in the vulnerability of German armor and the urgent need for new anti-tank weapons. Military journals and post-action reports would later cite the battle as a pivotal moment in the evolution of armored warfare, marking the end of German technical superiority in tank design, at least for the moment. The encounter at Mtsensk set off a cascade of changes across both German and Soviet commands. For German forces, immediate orders were issued to redeploy all available 88mm flak guns originally designed as anti-aircraft weapons into an anti-tank role wherever possible. Panzer divisions received directives to avoid direct engagement with T-34s unless supported by heavy artillery or air support. Training manuals were revised, tank crews drilled on new tactics emphasizing flanking maneuvers in close cooperation with infantry and engineers equipped with explosives and mines. On the Soviet side, the stunning success of the 21st Tank Brigade did not go unnoticed. Stavka, the Soviet High Command, issued orders to prioritize T-34 production at the Stalingrad and Kharkov factories, even at the expense of other armaments. Commanders across the Western Front were instructed to study Katakov's tactics, using terrain and speed to maximize the T-34's advantages and to prepare for further counterattacks along the Oryol and Bryansk sectors. As October drew to a close, both armies braced for the next phase. For the Wehrmacht, the myth of invincibility was gone, replaced by a grudging respect for Soviet ingenuity. Morale wavered as rumors of the T-34 spread from one battered unit to the next. Soviet soldiers, in turn, found renewed confidence. Where once they had retreated in the face of German armor, now they advanced with a tank that could meet the enemy on equal terms. In the days after Mtsensk, neither side could know that the true test was still to come. The road to Moscow remained contested, and as autumn rains turned roads to rivers of mud, the lessons of Mtsensk would shape every engagement that followed. The age of the T-34 had begun, and the Eastern Front would never be the same. Part 1: Lesser-known details. In the weeks following the clash at Mtsensk, the Eastern Front descended into a grinding stalemate shaped as much by mud and hunger as by strategy. Hidden deep in the archives of the Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow lies the diary of Junior Lieutenant Yuri Kirillov, a 22-year-old T-34 driver from the 32nd Tank Brigade. His entries, written in pencil on scraps of brown paper, reveal a side of the campaign absent from official communiques. "We have not seen bread in 3 days. The tank stinks of fuel and sweat, and the men sleep where they fall. The mud is so thick the tracks vanish, only the engine's roar keeps us moving. Commanders speak of heroism, but we curse the rain and the cold." German correspondence tells a mirrored story. A recently declassified Wehrmacht field report from Oberleutnant Franz Mahler, commander of an anti-tank platoon, describes the logistical chaos. "Our ammunition wagons are mired axle-deep. The supply columns cannot reach us. The T-34s appear and vanish in the fog, uncatchable. We have orders to hold, but no food, and the men are afraid to light fires for warmth." These ground-level realities sharply contradicted the confident tone of German High Command directives, which continued to speak of swift victory and enemy confusion. Discrepancies between official records and lived experience became ever more pronounced as autumn gave way to winter. Soviet after-action reports boasted of uninterrupted production at Stalingrad tractor factory, yet internal memos, uncovered decades later, paint a different picture: a desperate shortage of ball bearings, sabotage by terrified workers, and sporadic German air raids that frequently halted assembly lines. One such document, signed by Commissar Mikhail Kaganovich, pleads for immediate delivery of lubricants and steel, otherwise tomorrow's tanks will not run. On the German side, new anti-tank tactics prescribed by Berlin often broke down in the field. The celebrated 88mm guns, so effective in theory, proved cumbersome to redeploy in the viscous autumn mud, and their crews were exposed to Soviet snipers and mortars. Infantry units, tasked with close assaulting T-34s using bundled grenades or mines, reported catastrophic casualties. A captured German soldier, interrogated by Soviet NKVD officers, summarized it grimly: "You send us to kill iron monsters. We die for nothing." The environment itself became the most implacable adversary. The Rasputitsa, the infamous Russian mud season, transformed roads into quagmires, immobilizing tanks and wagons alike. Frozen nights followed days of rain, and both armies struggled to keep men and machines functioning. The mythology of mechanized blitzkrieg, so carefully cultivated in Nazi propaganda, dissolved in the face of a landscape determined to resist every invader. Part 2: Historian Perspectives. For decades, the encounter at Mcensk was cast in the shadow of larger battles: Moscow, Kursk, Stalingrad, its significance minimized in both Soviet and Western histories. Early Soviet accounts, dictated by Stalin-era censorship, portrayed the engagement as a flawless demonstration of Red Army superiority, with little mention of the improvisation and hardship experienced by the troops. Western historians, working with fragmentary intelligence, often misattributed the German setback to poor leadership or underestimation of Russian resolve, overlooking the technical and logistical innovations emerging on both sides. It was not until the 1990s, with the opening of Russian and German archives, that the true complexity of the post-Mcensk period came to light. Declassified Soviet Politburo minutes revealed bitter arguments over resource allocation, with tank production fiercely competing against aircraft and artillery for raw materials. Meanwhile, newly available German war diaries and technical manuals showed that the Wehrmacht's response was far less unified than previously believed. Rivalries between the Panzerwaffe, Luftwaffe, and artillery branches led to conflicting orders and wasted effort. Dr. Elena Markova, a leading Russian military historian, describes a fog of confusion that enveloped both sides. The myth of Soviet invincibility after Mcensk was a later invention. In reality, Red Army logistics teetered on collapse, and many crews went into battle with untested tanks and no radios. The Germans, for their part, were learning on the fly, forced to rewrite their own manuals in the mud. Current scholarship debates the true impact of the Soviet victory at Mcensk. Some argue it marked the beginning of a technological arms race that would define the Eastern Front, while others see it as a missed opportunity for both armies to capitalize on their adversaries' momentary weakness. The recent discovery of intercepted Enigma transmissions has added another layer, suggesting British and American intelligence may have overestimated the scale of Soviet success, contributing to the T-34 myth that persists in popular memory. What is clear, in the eyes of modern historians, is that Mcensk was not just a clash of steel and strategy, but a crucible in which both armies' weaknesses and their capacity for adaptation were laid bare. Part 3: Human Stories. Among the thousands swept up in these events were individuals whose fates would echo far beyond the muddy fields of 1941. One such figure was Sergeant Pavel Sokolov, a veteran tank commander from Smolensk. Born in 1915 to a family of machinists, Sokolov's skill at coaxing crippled vehicles back into battle earned him the nickname Iron Hands among his crew. In a letter to his wife Anna, preserved by his granddaughter, he wrote, "I patched the tracks with wire, and we crawled forward again. The boys ask me, why do we keep fighting? I tell them, because if we do not, there will be nothing left to go home to." Sokolov would survive the war, but the memory of friends lost at Mcensk haunted him for decades. After demobilization, he returned to factory work, teaching a new generation of engineers, and never again set foot in a tank. On the German side, Unteroffizier Karl-Heinz Bornmann, just 19 years old in 1941, was assigned to a Panzer IV unit facing the T-34s for the first time. His post-war memoirs, published in the 1960s, recall the terror and confusion. "We fired at the Russian tanks and saw the shells bounce off. They came on, silent and gray, as if nothing could stop them. I remember the mud, the cold, the fear in my stomach when the engine stalled. Later, they told us it was a technical problem. For us, it felt like fate. Captured in 1943, Bornemann spent years in Soviet captivity before returning to Germany. He became a schoolteacher, devoting his life to peace and reconciliation, his wartime experiences coloring every lesson. A third voice, seldom heard, is that of Maria Stepanova, a nurse with the 4th Shock Army's field hospital. Born in the rural outskirts of Rzhev, she volunteered in the first weeks of the war. Her diary, rediscovered in a family attic in the 2000s, recounts the endless stream of wounded and the improvisation required to keep them alive. We have no morphine, only vodka. I sew wounds by lantern light. The men cry for their mothers. Sometimes I think we are all lost, but then a tank crew brings in their wounded driver, and I remember why I am here. After the war, Stepanova became a doctor, advocating for veterans' care and never forgetting the faces she tried, and sometimes failed, to save. For these men and women, Mtsensk was not a line in a history book but a turning point that shaped the rest of their lives. Their stories, once buried beneath the weight of propaganda and official reports, now help us understand the true cost and meaning of this pivotal moment on the Eastern Front. Part 1: Strategic Consequences. In the immediate aftermath of the struggle near Mtsensk, both the Soviet and German commands issued urgent directives. Within days, German panzer units received new instructions on engagement ranges and armor vulnerabilities, alongside emergency requests for improved anti-tank weaponry. Orders circulated to avoid direct confrontations with Soviet heavy tanks unless supported by artillery or air power. Soviet tank brigades, for their part, were pulled off the line to refit, with frontline reports hastily compiled into new training pamphlets, some distributed within a week to units as far as Moscow's defensive ring. By late October, operational patterns on both sides began to shift. The Red Army restructured its armored forces, emphasizing mixed units of infantry, artillery, and tanks, hoping to avoid the isolation that had cost so many vehicles earlier in the campaign. The Wehrmacht, alarmed by reports filtering in from survivors and captured equipment, accelerated trials for shape-charge munitions and fielded the first batches of the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck to select units. German intelligence, previously dismissive of Soviet technical capabilities, began revising their estimates, triggering a chain reaction through the procurement offices of Berlin. Months later, as the Eastern Front solidified into a brutal war of attrition, the lessons drawn from Mtsensk echoed in strategic decisions. The Soviets redoubled efforts to standardize tank production, eventually making the T-34 the backbone of their armored spearheads. German industry, now under increasing pressure from the realities of attritional warfare, redirected resources from lighter models to heavier, more resilient tanks like the Panther and Tiger, vehicles conceived in direct response to the battlefield performance of Soviet armor. In the years that followed, the reverberations grew. Soviet armored doctrine, once ad hoc, became increasingly sophisticated, influencing the grand offensives that would one day reach Berlin. The Wehrmacht's early shock at the Red Army's resilience fostered a new, grudging respect among German commanders, reshaping their defensive strategies as the tide of war turned. For both sides, the events at Mtsensk forced a reckoning not only with the enemy, but with their own assumptions about modern mechanized warfare. Decades later, military historians would trace threads from those muddy fields to the armored standoffs of the Cold War. The doctrines, technologies, and organizational changes sparked in 1941 became the foundation for tank warfare across the globe, enduring long after the guns fell silent. Part 2: Turning Point Analysis. Had the events at Mtsensk unfolded differently, the trajectory of the Eastern Front might have been altered in subtle but far-reaching ways. A decisive German breakthrough, unimpeded by resilient Soviet armor, could have exposed the approaches to Moscow weeks earlier, potentially hastening the city's encirclement. Conversely, a total collapse of Soviet logistics might have delayed the development of the armored tactics that would later prove crucial at Stalingrad and Kursk. Historians frequently compare Mtsensk to other pivotal moments of adaptation, such as the British experience at Arras or the American learning curve in North Africa. In each case, the capacity for rapid innovation under fire proved more decisive than mere numbers or firepower. Dr. Viktor Polyakov, a leading authority on armored warfare, notes that Mtsensk was less a triumph of machines than a testament to military learning under extreme duress. Over time, the interpretation of Mtsensk's significance has evolved. Early Soviet narratives celebrated an unbroken line of victory, while post-war German accounts emphasize technical surprise and improvisation. In recent decades, access to previously classified documents and personal diaries has complicated the picture, revealing a battle marked as much by confusion and error as by heroism or technological superiority. A consensus has since emerged among scholars. Mcensk's greatest legacy lies not in the statistics of tanks destroyed or territory gained, but in its function as a crucible of adaptation. The clash forced both the Red Army and Wehrmacht to confront the limits of their doctrines and equipment, an uncomfortable reckoning that accelerated the evolution of armored warfare on both sides. Today, it is recognized not as a singular turning point, but as a vital inflection, one that foreshadowed both the horrors and innovations to come. Part 3: Legacy and Memorial. The men and women who endured Mcensk carried its legacy into the post-war world. Sergeant Pavel Sokolov, after years shaping young engineers in a Leningrad factory, became a quiet fixture at annual Victory Day commemorations. He rarely spoke of the war, but his students recall his insistence on resourcefulness and teamwork, qualities forged in the crucible of 1941. Karl-Heinz Bornmann, returning to a divided Germany, dedicated his life to education and reconciliation, eventually corresponding with former adversaries in the Soviet Union. His memoirs, translated into Russian in the 1990s, became required reading in several military academies as a testament to the human cost of armored warfare. Maria Stepanova, her wartime diaries at last published, became a symbol for generations of Russian medical workers. In 1975, a small memorial was erected at the site of her field hospital outside Mcensk, later expanded to include plaques honoring both Soviet and German casualties, a rare gesture of shared memory. Today, the fields around Mcensk are home to a modest but poignant museum. Among the artifacts are rusted tank tracks, bullet-scarred helmets, and fragments of personal letters. Each year, veterans, their descendants, and historians gather to lay wreaths, share stories, and reflect on the war's enduring lessons. The site has also become a case study for modern military leaders. Its lessons on adaptation, communication, and combined arms tactics are integrated into officer curricula from Moscow to West Point. The legacy of Mcensk endures not only in steel and stone, but in the doctrines, memories, and lives forever changed by what happened there. The confrontation outside Mcensk forced armies and individuals alike to adapt or perish, a reality that shaped the outcome of the Second World War and the very nature of modern armored conflict. In 1941, on the muddy roads of Oryol Oblast, the future of mechanized warfare shifted, not with a single victory, but through the hard lessons learned by those who survived.